As you're aware, we're in the middle of Christmas. And when we got together last week, we talked about something that had happened. It was good news, they said, for all people. That there was a hope that was being met through the arrival of a child who would grow into a man and represent God on earth to people who he came in contact with, and then even later. It was good news for all people. That's what he was heralded as someone who was bringing good news. Something happened. It made people stop and write. Many people stopped to write about the events of that day. It launched an entire movement. A movement that was so big and so strong that entire kingdoms, empires, began to fall prey to what would later be known as Christianity. Empires and kingdoms that formerly were somewhat ruthless, all of a sudden began to adopt all of these things. Something happened. Something happened. We can see something happened. And when we look at Scripture and what it says that he came, this man Jesus came to make peace happen, to bring peace on earth, to bring peace to the earth, to somehow institute a kingdom of peace where love and kindness and mercy became the currency that we interacted with. And it begins to foster a question in your mind, if you ever stop to think about it. When I say the word peace, I have a feeling that many of us see something or think something different in our mind, depending upon where we are in our life. And even if you think on a national or even global scale, the word peace can take on very different meanings. If you live in a home where maybe you're not getting along with your spouse or maybe even your children, then perhaps peace for you means that your relationship could be mended and you could be at peace with one another. If perhaps you are in a working environment where it's very contentious and it's hard to work, maybe peace is something that you desire there. Maybe you're in school and you've got a conflict situation with friends and you would like there to just be some peace, and you hear that maybe Jesus can bring that, and you have a picture of what that might look like. Or perhaps you're in a country where you're not allowed to worship, and so you're constantly nervous that you might get caught, or maybe worse yet, maybe you're in a nation or a country or a territory that's at war. Do you see, peace can take on a lot of different meanings when he says bringing peace to earth. I think a lot of us have this image of this picture in our head that when he brings peace, that it's as though there's no more arguing, there is no more conflict, everybody just gets along, and everyone just agrees on everything. I think that when we as Western Americans think about peace, our experience typically is that we are peacemakers. That's what we tell ourselves. And if you think about the way that we have made peace, it has been at the cost and expense of millions and millions of lives, who in that moment, regardless of where they were, what side they may have been taking, I can tell you neither felt any sense of peace. Nor would any of their families who lost them feel that. Or now, we don't necessarily have these wars that we go to. I mean, we do this, but we don't talk about it and read about it much. We instead, nowadays, use our wealth and power as a nation to make people do what we want them to do, which doesn't feel very peaceful, I'm sure. Although it does for us. For us, it does. You see, and I can say that, and some of you might be feeling a little uncomfortable at the moment, thinking, wow, you're kind of picking on my country, Jeremy. Well, here's the truth, is that we all do this, even individually. We all think that if I can just force them to behave, if I can force people to do what I want them to do, if I can overpower my spouse or my kids or my job or my employees or these students or my professors, then somehow I can create peace. And it's just kind of the way that we do it as humans. It doesn't make us any special or unique than anyone else. And so the question really becomes this: is what Jesus is bringing when he's bringing peace good news for all people? All people? Or are there going to be some that aren't happy about the change that he's bringing? Is it possible there will be some who think, I'm not really a fan of this Jesus thing because he might be sort of taking some power away from me, and I'm not sure I like that. You mean I got to do some things his way? Yeah. And that's hard. It's really hard. In fact, Jesus spent a lot of time talking about this. I've kind of put a little hand-picked selection of some verses and sections together out of the Gospels just to sort of look at what the peace of Jesus looked like in the lives of the disciples in that day. Because I'm going to tell you, it did not look very peaceful. When the announcement is that the Prince of Peace, the King of Peace is coming, what he's telling them is going to happen doesn't seem to match up. And we're going to cover a bunch of these really quick to sort of get into a core point that is probably going to make us all feel a little uncomfortable. So congratulations on coming to church today. All right, are you ready? When Jesus sends out his disciples, he sends them out with a warning. He sends them out into some cities to sort of go out ahead of him before he shows up. And he gives them some warnings. And this is what he warns them about. The Prince of Peace says this: "Look, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves. So be as shrewd as snakes and harmless as doves. But beware, for you'll be handed over to the courts and will be flogged with whips in the synagogues. You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell the rulers and other unbelievers about me." To which I read this and I ask myself, is there another way? Like, do I have to be flogged and drugged before rulers and go through all of this to tell them about you, Jesus? If I'm reading this or I'm in this moment with them, it doesn't sound very peaceful to me. In fact, Jesus says something else that seems to be a direct contradiction to the mission that we understand him to be here, and that's this right here. "Don't imagine that I came to bring peace to the earth. I came not to bring peace, but a sword." And this section of Matthew is disturbing because all of a sudden you've got mothers and daughters fighting and fathers and sons fighting and brothers and against brother and sister, and you're like, wait. What? I thought you were here to bring peace. It can sound like a contradiction. And if you pause and think about what he's really trying to get through to us, he's trying to kind of literally pierce into us this thought that maybe our definition of peace is not his. Maybe the way that we bring about peace in our lives and our world may not be the way he does it. And that kind of conflict becomes troublesome because here's what you may not know about yourself. You and I like to control the way God brings his peace on earth. We like to be the distributor and sort of tune it up a little bit for whatever circumstance we're in. And oftentimes peace comes through what we think is leveraging control and power over another person. And perhaps Jesus, when he comes, he's essentially saying, you think I came to bring the kind of peace you want. No. I'm going to bring the kind of peace I want. And there will be some who don't like it. There will be some who are very resistant to it. In fact, he sort of alludes to this in this entire section as we go through this part of Matthew. He begins to talk about some of the people and how they try to make him do things. Can you imagine? There are people who are trying to control Jesus. Who have ever heard of such a thing? People trying to control God and make God do what they want him to do. And here's how they describe it. Here's how Matthew writes about it. This is Jesus. To what can I compare this generation? It's like children playing a game in the public square. They complain to their friends. We played wedding songs for you, Jesus, but you wouldn't dance. We played funeral songs for you, Jesus, but you wouldn't mourn. We couldn't seem to figure out what we had to do to make you do what we wanted you to do. Maybe what he's bringing is not necessarily what we're expecting. And in all this section, he's provoking people. It's as though he's verbally poking at religious leaders and people around him to try to get his message through. And he continues this just to poke them. Just until you ever had a little, this happens in my house. I have a 5-year-old, an almost 10-year-old, and an 18-year-old. And occasionally one of them will get the pokes. You know what I'm talking about? Their finger comes out and they start doing this to one of the other ones. Now that's all fun when they're all on board with the poking game. But if you get one of them, especially the 5-year-old, who's not interested in playing, it's a problem. And I'm telling you that Jesus, this scenario, Jesus is poking them, and the leaders, the religious leaders of the day, they're like 5-year-olds. They aren't having any of it. And here's what he continues to do. He's on his way to Sabbath. He's traveling on his way to Sabbath, okay, to the synagogue. And this is what he says. About that time, Jesus is walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. Perhaps some of you have heard this story. His disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off some heads of grain and eating them. But some Pharisees, those are the religious leaders of the day, saw them do it and protested. Look, your disciples are breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath. And Jesus said to them, haven't you read in the Scriptures? That's poke number 1. These are the religious leaders. Of course they have read the Scriptures. They likely have them memorized. Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God, and he and his companions broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. Haven't you read that? And haven't you read, second poke, boink, in the law of Moses? Of course they've read in the Torah that the priests on duty in the temple may work on the Sabbath. I tell you, there is one here, he's talking about himself, who is even greater than the temple. But you would not have condemned my innocent disciples if you knew the meaning of the Scripture. I want you to show mercy and not offer sacrifices, for the Son of Man, that's Jesus, is Lord, even over the Sabbath. He's poking at them. I'm telling you, he's not making peace with the religious leaders and the fundamentalists of the day. There is no peace in this conversation. And as he's still on his way to the synagogue, this is what he says. Jesus went over to, I love this, to their synagogue, where he noticed a man with a deformed hand. The Pharisees asked Jesus, does the law permit a person to work by healing on the Sabbath? They were hoping he would say yes so they could bring charges against him. Interesting that there's a man with a deformed hand at the synagogue. Deformation in the day would have been seen as a curse by God, perhaps because of this man's sin or the sin of his family. It would have been seen as and understood as he has done something wrong to deserve this this deformity. And yet here's this man with a deformed hand at the synagogue, out the house of God. And I just want to say this question makes me want to use the S word. It's a stupid question. Like if you come across someone and you're Jesus and you can heal them, is he supposed to say, be back here tomorrow after the Sabbath is done and I will heal you? I mean, is that what he's supposed to say? When he comes across the need, just be patient with your need. No, he pokes at them a little bit more, and they're trying to set him up with this, and here's what happens. He answered, if you had a sheep, Pharisees, that fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you work to pull it out? I imagine it's a lot of work to pull a sheep out of a well. Never personally done it, but I'm thinking it's probably a lot of effort, especially just to get the sheep and the rope. Of course you would. And how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Yes, the law permits a person to do good on the Sabbath. And then he said to the man, hold out your hand. So the man held out his hand, and it was restored just like the other one. And the Pharisees called a meeting to plot how to kill him. How peaceful. How peaceful, this Prince of Peace, bringing peace. He's now got people who want to kill him. They're having meetings. Think about this. They're calling meetings on how to figure out how to kill the Prince of Peace. But it says Jesus knew what they were planning. So he left that area and many people followed him. Oh, and by the way, he healed the rest of the sick around him. I think just to tweak them. Think about this for a minute. We miss this one because they don't read on, right? He heals them to sort of tweak them. That makes them so mad they want to get together to kill him. And Jesus goes along and is like, oh, here's more sick people. I'll just heal them along the way too. You catch that, guys? You catch that? Just to irritate him even. This guy doesn't seem to be bringing the kind of peace that we would bring, is he? And he warns them not to tell them who he is. This fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah concerning him. You see, Jesus has joined a story in progress out of the Old Testament. And here's what it is that this Old Testament prophet, hundreds of years earlier, had written. Look at my servant whom I have chosen. This is God speaking. He is my beloved. My soul is pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not fight or shout or raise his voice in public. He will not crush the weakest reed or put out a flickering candle. You see, the way that he brings about his justice and his peace is not the way that we do it. We do it, and we see this often today. We do this by getting together and shouting and yelling and shouting people down and trying to control them and perhaps make laws to outlaw whatever it is that they're doing. And we try to just through oppression make them do what we want them to do. But this one, he doesn't do that. This messenger who was coming, who turned out to be Jesus, he would not do those kind of things. And this language here about crushing the weakest reed or putting out a flickering candle, it's indicative of people who are broken. That when he brings his justice, he will not crush the spirit of those who are broken. He can bring his justice and lift them up. Finally, he will cause justice to be victorious, and his name will be the hope of all the world. You see, the way we like to do it is to bring our power and influence and crush those around us into doing what we want them to do. And this man, just his name, is supposed to be representative of a hope for all the world. That's why it's a great hope. And peace is not going to come easily, is it? You know this personally. You know how challenging it is to just have peace yourself, with yourself. That's hard work. Let alone having peace with another human being. That's hard work too. And it means that occasionally people aren't going to get along and there may be little battles. This is why the authors could say that Jesus was good news for all people, but not necessarily a certain group of people, and it's those who desire power. And you may see this and think, well, we're sitting in a small church in Twin Falls, Idaho. I mean, we don't have a lot of power here. But you do. You do. And especially when we get together as a collective, we do. You know, tomorrow, something interesting is going to happen. Tomorrow, the Electoral College is going to get together and they're going to certify a president. And half of this country will feel like they are losing power. And half of this country is going to feel like they are gaining power. And we're foolish if we think somehow we're immune to this. Because in the system that Jesus is bringing, it's not about power. That's why his peace feels like a fight. That's why it's hard. It's hard to live and function. In the world system of Jesus, they're both in the wrong. And what we don't necessarily remember is when he's poking these religious authorities, he's poking the governmental authorities too. The religious authorities in Jerusalem are kind of like the governmental authorities over Israel at the time too. And he's poking all of them. He's essentially saying, you know, there's something about humans that we desire to be in control and have power. And we will sometimes do whatever it takes to make that happen. And Jesus is demanding that we live differently. You see, in the economy and the system of Jesus, we're not allowed to desire power. It's not allowed. And so when he says he's bringing peace and it's going to take a sword, it's really more like a scalpel. Because he's got to work on cutting parts of us out that desire power over other people. And that's really hard. That's really, really challenging. You see, Jesus represents a completely different system of hope. And as it turns out, you have probably been reading about this system of hope every Christmas you've been able to read. Because it shows up in one of the most famous verses that goes out on so many Christmas cards. He talks about this very thing. He points out to you and to me that it's not about the way we're going to govern, it's about what he's going to do. And that will be in conflict with us. And here it is. Are you ready? You may see this and think, how did I miss this? For a child is born to us, a son is given. The government will be on his shoulder. And he will be called a wonderful counselor, a mighty God, everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. His kingdom that he carries with him will always be in conflict with the kingdoms that humans build. Always. He's bringing the government on his shoulder, and oftentimes the Christmas cards don't go on to the next verse, but they should. His government and its, peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity. The passionate commitment of the Lord of heaven's armies will make this happen. You see, it's so easy to read that as a Christmas verse and think, oh, God has given a son, for unto us a child is born. And he's the Prince of Peace and a wonderful counsel. We tune into all those things, but we miss that part where it says that his government is on his shoulders. He's bringing what he wants. And this government and its peace will never end. But the way that the peace comes, come on, we know it's not easy. If it's hard for you to be at peace with yourself, it's even harder to be at peace with another person, especially one you may love sometimes, right? It's even harder to be in peace in a community or in a nation or in a world. And the only way that we have any hope of this kind of peace, this great hope that comes, is if by some way we can understand we have to set aside our power and walk and follow in the way that Jesus has asked us to, in his mercy and his kindness. Do you remember? He would not go into the streets shouting at people and trying to make his way. In fact, he went so far as to allow the rulers of the day to go all the way and take his life. And when they took his life, they saw that as bringing peace. They thought if we can just get rid of this guy, everything will go back to normal and Rome will leave us alone. We will finally be at peace again when we get rid of the Prince of Peace. And you and I, we just have this nature of trying to make it work our way. And Jesus, all through the Scriptures, all through the Gospels, is saying, you're not allowed to do that. Don't do that. You've got to follow me. You've got to do this my way, or it doesn't work. And folks, I'm telling you, there's a lot of pent-up frustration. There's a lot of anger. There are just a lot of negative emotions wrapped up in this year. And sometimes that spills out of people around us. Maybe perhaps sometimes it spills out of you. And I'm asking you, as I ask myself, to be different. To be different. Because what the world needs to see is this great hope, this Prince of Peace. And that only happens when we decide we're not going to be in control anymore. When we are not going to apply our power over others and oppress them. When we finally reach the point where we say, it doesn't matter what is happening around me, I can stay committed and focused to this mission that Jesus has called me to. Can you imagine how weird that will make you in today's world and how people at first won't believe it? But it's exactly what we need as a nation and as a people.